Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Gerald Sim, Professor of Film and Media Studies at Florida Atlantic University, and welcome to our latest edition of Critical Conversations, co-sponsored this year by the Center for the Future Mind, the Peace, Justice, and Human Rights Initiative, and the Department of Political Science. This is the third consecutive fall in which the series has featured a speaker from the Techlash, helping us to make sense of the fraught relationship between technology and society. Professor Veena Dubal is a scholar, activist, and attorney who specializes in employment and labor law. She has taught at UC Hastings College of the Law since 2015. Her research, a combination of ethnography, history, and critical theory, sits at the nexus of law, technology, and precarious work. She has been called an unlikely star in the tech world by TechCrunch. Unlikely, the tech industry newspaper implies, because she's just a scholar, merely a labor lawyer. That is, of course, something TechCrunch would say. But those are the very reasons why she's an important voice, not just in tech, but for tech, a voice that it really needs to hear. As a thought leader in the Techlash, Professor Dubal is concerned with how the lives and identities of workers are impacted by technological developments and emerging legal frameworks. And it has taken her to the front lines of gig workers' battles for equity and fairness, for their rights and ability to organize against some of the most powerful and well-financed companies in the world. What are workers to do when, as Professor Dubal shows in one of her best-known articles, companies like Uber are able to disregard regulation altogether, turning not just one industry on its head, but potentially undermining regulation itself in the long term? Professor Dubal traverses scholarly writing and popular criticism like a true public scholar. She has been cited by the California Supreme Court, published by top-tier law reviews and academic journals, has bylines in The Times, both of them, The Guardian, Slate, and was recently on stage at South by Southwest. She's also placed herself on the line against big tech, facing harassment on several fronts. It was the cost of being a public advocate against California's Proposition 22 2 years ago, a law that dismantled employment protections for app-based transportation and delivery drivers. Prior to her current gig at UC Hastings, she was a postdoctoral fellow at Stanford, where she was previously an undergraduate majoring in international relations and minoring in feminist studies. In between, she earned her law degree and PhD from UC Berkeley, where she wrote an ethnographic dissertation of the taxi industry in San Francisco. Proving both author Thomas Wolfe and jazz musician Chet Baker wrong, Professor Dubal shows that you can go home again, twice. She is currently a fellow at Stanford's Center for Advanced Studies in the Behavioral Sciences. We're very grateful that she's taking a break from all that to address us today. A presentation from her current research is titled Data Abolition for Fair Work. And we will open things up for questions after she concludes. If you have a question, please indicate that in the chat. Unless you ask that your question be posed on your behalf, you'll be prompted to unmute yourself, ask your question. So Veena, can you start us off by telling us a little bit about the origins of your research interests? I mean, in reading your work, there's a clear investment that I as a reader can feel in your writing. And we'd like to know, since we're really committed to the liberal arts around here, was this all already percolating when you were studying IR and feminist studies as an undergraduate?
No, and I should say first that I'm deeply, deeply grateful to you, Gerald, for inviting me, and that was the best and most exaggerated introduction I've ever received. So thank you for it. It was very, very generous. And to say thank you for all of you for being here today. My interest in this industry and in these practices really emerged from September 11th, interestingly. So I was here at Stanford during September 11th, and I was supposed to go to India to study partition and to do oral histories of people who had survived partition. And because of 9/11, the university wouldn't let me travel abroad. You might recall there was quite a bit of sort of hysteria in that moment. And so instead, I decided that I was going to study people who were were experiencing public acts of racial violence as part of the post 9/11 backlash. And I started hanging out with taxi drivers because a driver that summer, Sukhpal Singh Sodhi, had died. He had been murdered while working the night shift in the Mission District here in San Francisco. And his brother, Balbir Singh Sodhi, had died a few months earlier in what was considered the first act of racial violence in the aftermath of 9/11. What was interesting, though, is that Sukhpal Singh Sodhi's death did not get the kind of media attention or sympathy. It didn't garner the same amount of outrage as his brother's death did. And that was in part because there were no racial epithets that were muttered as he was murdered. He was murdered on the job. This was understood by the police as just what happened while you worked as a taxi driver. It was one of the risks of working as a taxi driver. So as I sort of was hanging out with these taxi drivers in the Bay Area, in the San Jose parking lot, what I learned was that while of course they had endured sort of horrible acts of violence and endured racial epithets, that they experienced something that I hadn't come there to study, which was the economic violence of no one traveling. So all of a sudden, these workers who were paying to work, I didn't understand that this was possible in America, but they were actually paying their employers $100 per shift to work. They were going home with less money in their pockets than they started out with. And it led me down this road to sort of understanding the political economy, the legal economy, the structures through which people labor in the US. And as I was doing this research, particularly in the taxi industry, which is sort of one of the first places where you see independent contractors laboring beginning as early as the 1950s, Uber and Lyft hit the streets of San Francisco. And in fact, I first heard about Uber and Lyft from taxi workers who were really angry that they were getting cut, these Uber drivers were cutting in front of them in line at the hotels in the taxi lines. And I sort of thought it was silly. I thought, like, who is going to ever ride in a unmarked car? It's like, no one's going to do that. This is just going to go away. This is clearly like illegal, etc. It didn't go away, and it marked the beginning not only of a global phenomenon in privatized transportation, but ultimately has displaced billions of dollars in public transportation. Really displaced how accessible public transportation could be, particularly in low-income communities, but is also lit the imagination of venture capitalists in thinking about how to extract as much as possible from workers. The systems, the legal systems that we can put in place, the structures that we can put in place, which I'm talking about today, that can be sort of as extractive as possible in ensuring that that workers get as little as they may be willing to accept.
Okay, would you like to begin?
Sure. So I ask that you guys bear with me. This is the first time I've given this talk. I'm going to start with using a PowerPoint, and then I'm going to move away from the PowerPoint because I think it can be a little bit distracting. But I'm just going to, for the introduction, I'm going to put it up just to frame my talk a little bit. And because this is the first time I've given this talk, I really look forward to your constructive feedback. So I'm going to go ahead and share it. Okay. So just 2 weeks ago, the White House Office of Science and Technology released a new non-legally binding handbook identifying 5 principles that, quote, should guide the design, use, and deployment of automated systems to protect the American public in the age of artificial intelligence, end quote. These principles called for automated systems that are safe and effective, that protect individuals from discrimination, that offer users control over how their data is used, that provide notice and explanation that an automated system is being used, and that allow users access to a person who can remedy any problems they encounter. This blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights specified that these enumerated rights extended to employment-related systems, including, quote, workplace algorithms that inform all aspects of the terms and conditions of employment, including but not limited to pay or promotion, end quote. Under each principle, the blueprint provides an illustrative example of the kinds of harms that the principle is meant to address. One such example, used to specify what defines unsafe and ineffective automation in the workplace, involves an unnamed company that has installed AI-powered cameras in their delivery vans to monitor the driving habits of workers for alleged safety reasons. The blueprint states that the system, quote, incorrectly penalized drivers when other cars cut them off. As a result, drivers were incorrectly ineligible to receive a bonus, end quote. Thus, the specific harm that is identified is a mistaken calculation by an automated variable pay system developed by the company. But what the blueprint does not specify is that the company in question, Amazon, does not directly employ their delivery workers. The company hires delivery service providers, or DSPs, who they treat as contractors. In this non-employment arrangement, Amazon doesn't provide workers' compensation, unemployment insurance, health insurance, or the protected right to organize. Nor does it guarantee individual DSPs minimum wage or overtime compensation. Instead, the company pays them a variable hourly rate based on fluctuations in demand and routes, along with bonuses based on a quantified digital evaluation of their on-the-job behavior, including, quote, service, safety, and client experience, these sort of amorphous qualitative evaluations. Some DSPs, while completely reliant on Amazon for business, hire drivers as employees. These Amazon created and controlled small businesses rely heavily on their automated bonuses to pay for support, repairs, and driver wages. As one DSP complained to an investigator, quote, Amazon uses these AI surveillance cameras allegedly to make sure that they have a safer driving workforce, but they're actually using them not to pay us. They just take our money and expect that to motivate us to figure it out. And so you'll see sort of an effort in this image to parse out what goes into this variable pay through an illustrative DSP scorecard. So presented with this additional information, we should ask again, what exactly is the harm of this automated system? Is it, as the White House blueprint states, the algorithm's mistake which prevented the worker from getting his bonus? Or is it the structure of Amazon's payment system, rooted in evasion of employment law, data extraction from labor, and surveillance? Amazon's automated control structure and payment mechanisms represent an emergent and under-theorized firm technique arising from the logic of informational capitalism. That is the use of what I call algorithmic wage discrimination to maximize profits and to exert control over worker behavior. By algorithmic wage discrimination, I mean to refer to a practice in which individual workers are paid different wages, calculated with opaque and ever-changing formulas, using granular data on location, individual behavior, demand, supply, and other factors for broadly similar work. This form of wage discrimination has been made possible through dramatic changes in cloud computing and machine learning technologies in just the last decade. Though firms have relied upon performance-based variable pay for some time, for example, we're all familiar with the use of bonuses and commission systems to influence worker behavior, my research in the on-demand ride-hail industry suggests that algorithmic wage discrimination raises a new and distinctive set of concerns. In contrast to more traditional forms of variable pay, Algorithmic wage discrimination, whether practiced through Amazon's scorecards or through Uber's dynamic pricing, which I'll talk more about, arises from and functions akin to price discrimination, in which individual consumers are charged as much as a firm determines they are willing to pay. As a labor management practice, algorithmic wage discrimination allows firms to personalize and differentiate wages for workers, paying them to behave in ways that the firm desires for perhaps as little as the system determines that they may be willing to accept. Given the information asymmetry between workers and the firm, companies can calculate the exact wage rates necessary to incentivize desired behaviors among workers, while workers can only guess as to why they make what they do. So in addition to being rife with calculated mistakes that are difficult to ascertain and correct, as the blueprint correctly underscores, algorithmic wage discrimination creates a labor market in which people who are doing the same work with the same skill for the same company at the same time may receive different hourly pay. Moreover, this personalized wage is determined through an obscure, complex system that makes it nearly impossible for workers to predict or understand their constantly changing compensation. This system, of course, flies in the face of legal and cultural norms around payment developed over the last century that constitute what we might consider a contemporary moral economy of work. Although the US-based system of work is largely regulated through contracts with a strong deference to the managerial prerogative, which means basically a boss can do what they want, two general restrictions, judicial restrictions with respect to wages have emerged as a result of social and labor movements. Minimum wage and overtime laws, which set a price floor for the purchase of labor, and prohibitions on discrimination in the terms, conditions, and privileges of employment, which require employers to provide equal pay for equal work. Both sets of wage laws can be understood as forming a core moral foundation for the regulation of most work in the US, and in turn, certain ideals of fairness have, we can argue, become embedded in cultural and legal expectations about work. So in part one of today's presentation, I am going to examine how recently passed laws in California and Washington state specifically legalize algorithmic wage discrimination for certain sectors of work, and compare it with and talk about how it compares with and undermines more than a century of legal and social norms around fair pay. In part two, I'm going to draw on a first of its kind long-term ethnographic research project that I've been engaged in for almost 10 years, for better or for worse, to understand the everyday grounded experience of workers earning through and experiencing algorithmic wage discrimination. And specifically, I draw on the experiences of on-demand ride-hail workers in California before and after the passage of this law, Proposition 22, that Gerald mentioned, which makes it very difficult for workers to predict and ascertain their hourly wages. And I examined the practice of algorithmic wage discrimination in relationship to workers on the job meaning-making and their moral interpretations of their work experiences. And then finally, in part three, I explore how workers and worker advocates have used existing data privacy laws and cooperative frameworks to address or minimize the harms of algorithmic wage discrimination. And I propose an alternative path. So I'm going to stop sharing now. And this is old-fashioned, but ask that you just listen. So I first want to spend a little more time talking about what exactly algorithmic wage discrimination is as a labor management practice. So in Carl Poliani's terms, algorithmic wage discrimination, I think, is a disembedding phenomenon. So it's a practice that eschews existing norms around social, economic, and political relationships between firms and workers. It is, in essence, an economic practice, even an economic project, that is changing social imaginaries with regard to the kinds of remuneration practices that are considered normal, acceptable, and fair. Because the vast majority of people who endure the unpredictable low variable pay associated with this practice are immigrants and people of color, the practice may also exacerbate existing racialized economic inequalities, and for these populations, impede the possibility of economic mobility through work. As a highly personalized and variable form of compensation, algorithmic wage discrimination was adopted by on-demand labor platform companies to solve for a particular problem that accompanies the classification or misclassification of their workers as independent contractors. Since drivers aren't treated as employees of the firm, and the primary legal indicia of employment status is control exerted by the hiring entity, these on-demand firms try not to directly control workers as to where they must go and when they must go there, which of course would be the simplest way of calibrating supply and demand. Instead, they use data extracted from workers' labor and fed into automated tools to incentivize temporal and spatial movement. In other words, the companies use algorithmic wage discrimination to solve the problem of meeting demand. So companies like Uber refer to some of the mechanisms by which they determine driver pay through the label of dynamic pricing, explicitly drawing a connection to the practice of price discrimination, which you probably are familiar with. Price discrimination typically involves segmenting consumers by their willingness to pay, rather than charging a flat rate. Coupons, student discounts, bulk purchases, these are among some of the most common forms of price discrimination. And as these examples make clear, price discrimination long predates algorithmic computing. But individualized data collection and machine learning makes the practice much more powerful and profitable for companies today. As one CEO of a dynamic pricing search engine noted, that they are able to use, quote, data to change pricing based on where a shopper is located, how much they've spent previously, and other behavioral indicators, end quote. While price discrimination is illegal if it is intentionally based on race or gender, in many sectors and for many decades, sociologists have found that price discrimination often results in poor people and people of color paying more for goods and services. This is not instinctive. More recent research suggests that consumer price discrimination in hospital services, hospitality, air travel, housing, and ride hail exacerbates racial inequalities, even absent intentional discriminatory profiling. So in 2017, Uber somewhat pulled back the curtain with respect to its use of price discrimination to set fares for riders. So prior to this moment, the company had calculated fares using a combination of mileage, time, and surge multipliers based on geographic demand. In an interview with Bloomberg, Uber's head of product explained, quote, the company applies machine learning techniques to estimate how much groups of customers are willing to shell out for a ride. Uber calculates riders' propensity for paying a higher price for a particular route at a certain time of day. For instance, someone traveling from a wealthy neighborhood to another Tony spot might be asked to pay more than another person heading to a poorer part of town, even if demand, traffic, and distance are same, end quote. So despite the implication of this hypothetical offered by the head of product, extant empirical research suggests that surge pricing, that is paying people more based on the time of day or their location, is more complicated and unpredictable, causing riders who start in non-white, low-income areas to have to wait extended periods for a ride, while in other instances, price gouging riders fleeing death and disaster. While price discrimination is familiar in this consumer context, Uber and similar companies have broken brand new ground by using similar methods to determine worker pay. As a 2017 expose in the New York Times reported, Uber is engaged in an extraordinary behind-the-scenes experiment in behavioral science to manipulate drivers in the service of its corporate growth. Indeed, Noam Scheiber, the journalist, found that, quote, employing hundreds of social scientists and data scientists, Uber has experimented with video game techniques, graphics, and non-cash rewards of little value that can prod drivers into working longer and harder, and sometimes at hours and locations that are less lucrative for them, end quote. While US-based Uber drivers were previously paid a base fee based on mileage, amounts that vary per geographic location and time. They have, since the passage of Proposition 22 in California, which among other things legalized algorithmic wage discrimination, received a base fare rooted in what Uber calls upfront pricing. This is now true all over the US in major urban areas, and also has been true for some time in other parts of the world. So what is upfront pricing? Upfront pricing, who knows? It's an algorithmically determined amount, no idea how they determine it. But in addition to this very low base fare, Uber drivers rely upon any number of offers, bonuses, surges, quests, and other wage products, what I call wage products, from which to raise their base fare, which in most cases is, of course, untenably low by itself. These wage products, the additional financial incentives and dynamic pricing structures, are designed and deployed to influence individual worker behavior without directly telling a driver what to do. The relevant point here is that these products are not the same for every driver, nor are they the same across time. For example, the surge multiplier that Diego is presented may not be the same as the multiplier that is sent to Marta, even if both workers are working in the same area at the same time. The bonus offer that Ahmed receives on any given week is not the same as the offer sent to Sanjeev. The reasons that underlie these differences are opaque, the logic hidden behind black box algorithms. One of the central levers that Uber uses to manipulate worker behavior is the rate at which it offers rides to various drivers. Uber and other on-demand companies do not pay workers for what they variably refer to as non-engaged time, non-passenger platform time, or P1 time, which is really all of those terms are just terms to describe the time period during which workers are waiting for a fare and have not been dispatched one by the workers and by the company. So this accounts for variably and unpredictably about 40% of overall time on the job. So big chunk of your time you're not getting paid. Importantly, this waiting time is not purely a factor of demand or driver quality or quantity. The company's overall goal is to keep as many drivers on the road in order to be able to quickly address fluctuations in demand. Thus, they're motivated to elongate the time between sending fares to any one driver, so long as that wait time does not lead the driver to end their shift. Drivers believe the machine learning technologies can learn the amount of time a specific driver may be willing to wait for a fare. So if someone gets frustrated after 15 minutes, the machine learns that. In contrast to firms like Caviar, which limit the number of workers that can log on at any specific time, Uber primarily addresses the situation of the number of workers exceeding the number of customers by keeping workers waiting and unpaid, while offering these tantalizing bonuses that keep drivers on the road with the possibility of receiving a larger fare in the future. These practices, I argue, run afoul of basic legal and moral expectations around work. And yet this is the default practice for many on-demand firms across the economy. In at least 9 states, state legislatures have protected these practices in the ride-hail sector by passing statutes that classify workers laboring for transportation network companies like Uber and Lyft as independent contractors and leaving the terms of their payment to be settled entirely through the contracts that Uber sends to the workers that they then have to accept on their phone before they're able to labor. And in 2 states, California and Washington, the legislatures have explicitly legalized non-payment for non-engaged time. In California, the passage of Proposition 22 did exactly this. Instead, workers receive a guarantee of 120% of the minimum wage for the area in which they are working, but only after they are dispatched a fare. Or an order in the case of food delivery platforms. So a recent study by Rideshare Drivers United found that on average, drivers are making about $6 in California per hour. In Washington state, a similar piece of state level legislation was passed through a sweetheart deal between Uber and the Teamsters up there. And while legalizing the practice of not paying workers for this non-engaged time, it effectively provides official sanction for algorithmic wage discrimination, making this officially a legal form of digitalized piecework. It's silent, however, on other aspects of the practice, including the data collection that makes the algorithmic wage discrimination possible and the dispersal of wage products that facilitate driver control. So how do these new laws legalizing algorithmic wage discrimination comport with the prevailing regime of work laws that have emerged as the result of labor and social movements in the past century? Since this isn't a law talk and I have limited time, I'll limit this portion and ask that you read it in the paper that I will post in the next few weeks, just to say that this practice fundamentally violates the norms embedded in both minimum wage laws and anti-discrimination laws, not only because workers' wages often fall below the minimum wage, and because they sometimes experience systemic discrimination based on their protected identities. According to Uber's own data, women, for example, make 8% less than men, but also because the pay is unpredictable and variable between workers and across time. It is emphatically not equal pay for equal work. So part 2 of the paper, how do drivers themselves experience this phenomenon? Many drivers are attracted to on-demand work because they long to be free from the scheduling structures of the Fortis work model, or as my previous research has shown, they have to have structures that are more flexible than the Fortis work model due to illness, due to childcare responsibilities, etc. They largely conceive of their labor through the lens of the model's payment structure, despite this fact, the hourly wage. Workers find that in contrast to more standard employment dynamics, being directed by an app involves opacity, deception, and manipulation. So drawing on findings from this long-term ethnographic study of Uber drivers in California, I show that the values and norms embedded in both anti-discrimination laws and minimum wage laws that I referenced previously have become schema through which workers frame their work experiences as harmful. So in defining the algorithmic pay structures as unfair and unjust, workers speak of their low hourly wages, despite the fact that they are not paid by the hour. So in describing the harms that they suffer, they draw on the language of anti-discrimination law, condemning the variability of their income over time and its variability in comparison to other drivers. The fact that different workers made different amounts for largely the same work was a source of grievance, defined through inequities that often pitted workers against each other. Key to dismantling worker power, I should add, leading them to wonder what they were doing wrong or what others had figured out that they had not. So for example, Adil, a refugee from Syria who lives 2 hours outside of San Francisco and drives in, sleeping in his car for 6 days out of the week, told me, "My friends, they make it, so I keep going. Maybe I can figure it out. It's unsecure and I don't know how they do it. I don't know how I am doing it, but I have to. I mean, I don't find another option. In a minute, if I find something else, oh man, I will be out immediately. I'm a very patient person, that's why I can continue. But now for the past 2 days, I was like, I am stupid. I should not be dragged like this by this company. I started praying recently. Maybe God can help me. I'm working hard. Why can't I make it?" In addition to complaints about the unfairness of the low, variable, and unpredictable hourly pay, workers made 2 other moral judgments about the techniques through which they were remunerated. First, they frequently described the process of attempting to earn not through the lens of gaming, as is often discussed in literature, but through the lens of gambling. Ben, a full-time Uber driver who supports his wife and 3 kids in Los Angeles, said to me over the phone, "It's like gambling. The house always wins. They're incentivizing every driver to accept every ride. This is why they give tools and remove tools. So you accept every ride, even if it's costing you money. You always think that you're going to hit the jackpot. If you get 2 to 3 of these good rides, those are the screenshots that people share in the months ahead. Those are the receipts that they will show. Hey," starts laughing, "it's almost time to roll the dice. I gotta go." And he gets off the phone. Second, drivers portrayed the algorithmic changes or interventions that prevented them from earning as they had hoped or expected as trickery or manipulation. As Dietrich, a part-time driver in Los Angeles, told me, it's constant cognitive dissonance. So you're free, but the app controls you. You've got it figured out, and then all of a sudden it changes. Vacillating between feelings of possibility, impossibility, freedom, and control, workers experience algorithmic wage discrimination as a practice in which the structures and functions of the machine boss are designed to take advantage of them by providing the illusion of agency. Drawing on these insights, I argue that this practice is a deeply predatory labor management technique, one that preys on feelings of hope of the most vulnerable workers while limiting real possibility of economic certainty and security. In addition to the salient constraints on autonomy and threats to privacy that accompany the rise of on-the-job data collection, algorithmic wage discrimination poses significant problems for worker mobility, for worker collectivity, and for worker power, as I previously mentioned, both on the job and outside of it. And I want to emphasize once again here that because these workforces are primarily made up of immigrants and subordinated racial minorities, both in the U.S. and in other geographic contexts, the most people on the margins of society, these harmful economic impacts are also deeply racialized. So finally, what are drivers doing about this, and what are advocates doing about the rise of this new practice? So in addition to decrying and mobilizing against violations of the minimum wage, overtime, and vehicle reimbursement laws, workers in California, drawing on the knowledge and experience of their co-workers in the United Kingdom, have developed a sophisticated understanding of the laws governing data at work. So in the UK, a self-organized group of drivers called the App-Based Drivers and Couriers Union have not only sued Uber for worker status, but they started this organization, James Farrar started this organization called the Worker Info Exchange, and they've used GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation Act, to lay claims to a set of positive rights with regard to the data and algorithms that determine their pay. As a GDPR-like law is set to go into effect in California for workers, drivers organizing in this state are planning to do the same, grounding their demands in three basic rights: the right to access the data that is extracted from their labor and the algorithms that pay and direct them, two, the right to contest the validity of the data that is collected through their labor, and the right to explainability, or the right to understand the algorithms that pay and direct them. And these sort of right to know or rights to know frameworks are governed and how they are governed and remunerated by automation technologies are largely reflective of the rights that scholars of informational capitalism have argued the public needs with regard to data and machine learning, models of transparency built on, or models of governance built on consent and transparency. And I think that although we should understand these as powerful attempts to draw attention to the use of data and opaque algorithms to control workers and their wages, in the UK context, it's important to note that they've largely failed. So in theory, Article 22 of GDPR provides workers with the right to know how they have been subjected to automated decision-making and to challenge these decisions, while Article 15 grants data subjects the right to receive a copy of their personal data and to sort of attain information about how that data is being processed. To date, some on-demand companies have made data downloads available to workers who request them, including Amazon Flex. Other firms have successfully fought off attempts by workers under GDPR to achieve some level of transparency. So companies like Uber and Ola have stymied these demands by arguing that, quote, the safety and security of their platform may be compromised if the logic of such data processing is disclosed to workers, end quotes. The logic of pay structures are disclosed, that this will somehow disrupt the safety of their companies. Despite 2 GDPR lawsuits against Uber, one for general transparency requests, little is known about the wage system. One group of workers with the assistance of Worker Info Exchange requested information on data processing and the upfront pricing system, which I mentioned we are now using in the US and have no understanding of, but it's key to understanding how workers are being remunerated. And Uber refused to provide the information. The workers sued, and the court ruled, quote, the drivers did not substantiate that they wanted to be able to verify the correctness of the data processing, only that they had a wish to gain insight into how Uber uses the data in its algorithms. And the court concluded that GDPR Section 15 doesn't support this goal. So the court also denied the workers' request for information about work allocation. So like the blueprint that was published by the White House 2 weeks ago, the primary focus of courts in interpreting GDPR seems to be, at least in this context, focused on potential mistakes or violations of the law, not generalized transparency. Even if workers succeed in obtaining some degree of transparency about data extracted and deployed through algorithms, asserting any worker power over the automated decision-making management systems will remain a formidable task, especially absent collective bargaining agreements. For example, through one of these requests, Worker Info Exchange has succeeded in gaining access to data by Amazon, as well as a guidance document from Amazon Flex. But this knowledge has not ended the practice of digitalized variable pay. Other workers in both the US and Europe have responded to these practices by creating data cooperatives to create some transparency around the data extracted from workers' laborers, to attempt to understand their wages, and to assert ownership over the data that they collect at work. The limitations with this approach, however, are threefold. As an initial matter, the assessments made through this kinds of cooperative data gathering structures are constantly changing as the practices of algorithmic control continue to change through on-demand systems. This limits the cooperative's ability to provide workers with the stability and predictability they seek. So for example, in my own research, drivers who figured out a way to hit their income target for a few months would often be devastated when their knowledge about the system was inevitably upended by the app when the system changed. So while data cooperatives might give workers some derivative knowledge over the kinds of data that's collected about them, they are not able to exert control over the constantly changing automation processes that control them. Second, selling cooperatively collected data may be a small income source for workers, and that data might be occasionally useful to regulators, especially since on-demand firms often deny access to data on privacy or intellectual property grounds. But it also assumes that this kind of collection doesn't carry with it social risks. Finally, and perhaps the most troubling problem with worker data cooperatives is their reliance on third-party data brokers. Workers who sign up to be members of the driver's seat cooperative here in the US, for example, have two options. They can manually generate their data, which relies on the drivers to record their own activity and log their own daily earnings, or they can opt for automatic tracking, which the website says is a hassle-free way of tracking their gig work. So extracting data from the variety of different apps that members use turns out to be extremely complicated and labor-intensive. And so the data co-op relies on a third-party service called Argyle to connect on-demand labor platforms and import their earnings and data activities. But Argyle is itself a data broker that watchdog organizations such as coworker.org have flagged for potentially fraudulent practice, like phishing workers to extract their employment data. The company claims to have the employment data of 80% of gig workers, which it makes available for sale as its primary source of profits. This arrangement calls into question the long-term efficacy of workers owning their own data, since well-capitalized data brokerage firms have the same data sets. This then raises a host of other concerns. Can companies use this data to create and sell data derivatives that track workers into certain wage brackets based on their income? Can they use this data to target workers for predatory payday loans or to deny other kinds of credit? Who knows? This isn't to say that workplace transparency is not crucial to worker power. Rather, it is to say that transparency and legibility alone do not address the harms caused by algorithmic wage discrimination, because they seek to understand, not directly impact the source of those social harms. It is not primarily the secrecy behind digitalized workflows that result in low and unpredictable wages, but rather the extractive logics of well-financed firms that institutionalize these digitalized practices that cause both individual and collective harm. I argue then that due to the constantly changing nature of machine learning technologies and the power dynamics of the workplace, both of these attempts at transparency through data rights as well as through cooperative structures, though important as vehicles for resistance, have done and will do little to mitigate the objective and subjective harms of algorithmic wage discrimination. And given the limitations, I propose a more direct solution: a statutory or regulatory ban on the practice altogether, including but not limited to a ban on remuneration through digitalized piece pay. This would, in effect, not only put an end to the gamblification of work and the uncertainty of hourly wages, but it would also disincentivize certain forms of data extraction and retention that may harm low-wage workers down the road. Similar to proposed bans on targeted advertising, which attempts to limit the use of deep stores of personal data to make money from targeted ads, a peremptory ban on algorithmic wage discrimination may also limit the growth of fissured work under informational capitalism. If firms cannot use gambling mechanisms to control worker behavior through variable pay, they will have to find ways to maintain a flexible workforce while paying this workforce predictable high wages. In calling for this ban, I am inviting scholars of data governance to think more expansively about the abolition of digital surveillance in the workplace and beyond. While this talk has been focused on algorithmic wage discrimination as a labor management practice in on-demand or gig work sectors, where workers are frequently treated as independent contractors without protections, I want to end by emphasizing that its significance is not limited to this domain. So long as this practice does not run afoul of minimum wage or anti-discrimination laws, nothing in the existing laws of work make this form of digitalized variable pay illegal. The core motivation of labor platform firms to adopt algorithmic wage discrimination, namely labor control, apply to many other sectors of work, and we shouldn't be surprised to see it spread into other sectors of employment. In fact, we already know that this is seeping into retail as well as into healthcare. While many employees in more traditional workplaces would initially, of course, resist being compensated in this way, if firms succeed in imposing it, the practice will slowly become normalized, producing new cultural norms around remuneration for work. The on-demand sector thus serves as an important and portentous site of forthcoming conflict over long-standing ideas about fair work and moral wages. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Veena. I'm going to remind everybody that if you want to pose a question, just put it in the chat. Unless you want me to pose it for you, I'll ask you to unmute, and the floor will be given to you. I think people are kind of processing, trying to come up with their own questions, but so I'll, for now, ask you a couple of questions that I had.
Sure.
So, I'm interested in, what struck me was, how these workers find each other, and obviously there's a systemic inability to do that. I'm not sure it's by design, right? But clearly, they're not going out of their way to connect these drivers together, and especially when research has been done about in Indonesia, for example, with regards to Gojek riders, and they have they have a social infrastructure where they can organize physically, but such a system or social fabric, right, culture doesn't exist here. So how do they find each other? And even if you find some of them, you can't really find too. I mean, how many can you actually find, right? And that every once in a while you hear about people going offline, right? We'll go offline today, right? But then there's always somebody who hasn't heard of this, and so there will be drivers out there. Right.
Yeah. So I think I think we can understand this as sort of rooted in this form of work rooted in anti-union logics, because it is so atomizing and individualizing. The way that workers find each other, for example, the workers in the Rideshare Drivers United that I study, and this is one of very few groups of self-organized workers. So this isn't like a nonprofit that came in and tried to organize workers, or even sort of a union that has been working to organize workers. These were workers who were able to find one another after Uber and Lyft lobbied to create waiting spaces in the airport parking lot. This is a huge fight a few years ago for various reasons. The taxi industry, the shuttle industry didn't want Uber and Lyft, obviously, to impede on what was this significant market for them. And what no one, I think, really anticipated is that those lots became a site of meeting, a site of convergence. And so the first protest in California, which involved, sorry, not, I shouldn't say the first protest, the first direct action. The first protest was in front of Uber headquarters in 2014 after wage cuts, but the first direct action where workers tried collectively to turn off their apps to make a point happened in Los Angeles as a result of relationships that formed in the airport parking lot, where people were really pissed that this actually, that one of the things that I described in the paper was that the technique that they had all been using to get good rides was all of a sudden made unavailable to them. And if they did that technique, basically rejecting, a little bit complicated, but rejecting certain rides from the airport, they were temporarily terminated from the app. And so they held a work stoppage, but it was still relatively small. The organization, the collective of workers, it was only basically workers who worked at the airport, which is not everyone. And so what happened was that there was this awesome guy, Ivan Pardo, who was a very, very cool computer scientist who had been working on social change movements for some time, and he built an app that is essentially a what they call their water cooler. So they advertise the app and their organization, their union, via Facebook, via like WhatsApp groups. Get people to sort of become interested in that way. And then in the app, it's called the Solidarity app, driver organizers will contact these people who have signed up, who might be interested, and have really long conversations with them, one-on-one conversations with them about what's going on. And then they sort of decide, okay, is this someone who wants to join the organization? Do they want to be a member? Do they want to be an activist? Like in what role do they envision themselves playing? And I think the number of members that they've contacted in this way, or people who have agreed to be members, exceeds 20,000 workers in California right now. That's not to say that there aren't, that this is an easy sector to organize. There are obvious difficulties, but I think that it's important to note that it can be done, and that workers themselves are the only ones who have sort of shown a willingness to do it and to do it properly. And I think that what's sort of troubling to me is that a lot of major unions have looked at this sector and they've just thought, well, this is impossible to deal with. We can't, there's too many people leaving and joining, and it's not a steady sort of form of work for anyone. It's hard to actually talk to people, to meet with them. And so they've kind of just turned their back on the sector altogether. And I think that what those unions don't realize in either turning their back altogether, or worse yet, forming alliances with Uber and Lyft for fake unions, to create company unions, that what they are doing is paving the way for overall work degradation, because there's nothing about this model, as we found out after the passage of Prop 22, that is keeping it limited to the on-demand sector. The ride-hail sector and the food delivery sector. So some of the folks in the audience might remember, after Proposition 22 was passed, a venture capitalist, I think his name is Paul Graham, wrote an op-ed in The Information, which is a widely read technology online magazine or newsletter. And he wrote this op-ed, and the op-ed basically, it was literally, I think, called "What Proposition 22 Makes Possible." And he talked about how these practices should now be extended to retail, to hospitality, to education, to the restaurant sector, to the healthcare sector. He named all the sectors that this person with like $1 bazillion is thinking about investing in. And soon thereafter, another proposition was placed on the ballot, which was to do the same thing for the healthcare sector. And this again is in the middle of the pandemic. And the whole notion was that we're just going to legalize this now, and then we're going to build this whole gig nurse sector. And it sounds kind of absurd and ridiculous, as I have to say. I thought on-demand ride-hail sounded absurd and ridiculous back in 2013. But in fact, talking to national nurses unions, this is a huge looming concern. It is something that they are developing campaigns around already. And to some extent has already happened both internally through staffing agencies in hospitals. There's all kinds of different Uber for nurses that allocates work within a hospital. But then also you see this in the context of traveling nurses who are once employees are being switched over to independent contractors. And you can imagine, once you start thinking about this, which I now have done for some time, how these kinds of gambling techniques, these incentives, these like little bonuses here and there, how really this could apply to many, many, many different workforces. And so even if someone is making well above the minimum wage, what I want to emphasize is that this fundamentally transforms the experience of work in a way that's very troubling. And to sort of come back a full circle to your original point, it also, and I hope you got this from my presentation, it also really undermines the potential for worker power. So one of the things that the labor movement fought for vociferously at the early part of the 20th century, and this is actually particularly true prior to the passage of the Fair Labor Standards Act, when the National Recovery Administration was passed, and there were different wage prices set for different sectors. One of the things that folks really fought for was the standardization of wages. Because when one group of workers are making one set of wages, and when another set of workers are making another set of wages, but they're working in the same industry, it creates an incredible sense of divisiveness. And that is by design, right? Because if workers are mad at each other, they're not going to be mad at the boss.
Yeah, and just from my own experience, I mean, there are drivers who are happier than others, and those that seem happiest are the ones who are doing it to get away from a spouse. But anyway, Bill Okerman in the audience had a question. So Bill, would you like to unmute yourself to pose your question?
Sure. Hi, Veena. That was an interesting presentation. I'm from Massachusetts, and I've been acting as an advisor to a group of drivers out in this neck of the woods called the Boston Independent Drivers Guild. Yeah. And following, among other things, your work very closely, but also other analysts and the like, and also the legal aspects of things, particularly as it relates to the laws out here in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And I'm curious if you're familiar with the analysis of Hubert Horan, the transportation analyst. Yep. And if so, if you can comment on it as to, even in addition to all of these labor practices, if it's even ever going to be viable, or at some point will just not work.
Yeah. So I am very familiar with Hubert's work, and I actually also was on the board of the Massachusetts organization that was fighting against Proposition 22 that recently was dissolved. So I'm very familiar with what's been happening in the Massachusetts context and what is continuing to happen. I should say that, for those who are not familiar with Horan's work, he's an economist who essentially says, look, this is not a financially viable system. And I largely agree with him. So what I will say is that in the taxi industry, there was an attempt to deregulate the market in the 1970s, corresponding to the rise of neoliberalism. And in major urban areas, it failed miserably when there was an infinite supply of cars and no regulation over vehicle caps. Even when there was regulation over fares, many companies went out of business. So it makes sense to me from both a historical and economic perspective that it doesn't it doesn't appear that this model is particularly profitable. And of course, to date, for the most part, except for maybe in quarters where they sold off a bunch of stuff, these companies have not been profitable. And I think that's a particularly important point as we discuss the passage of these new laws. So, I think that what folks in Washington and California did not embrace when those third category laws were passed, was that they were passing laws based on a really exploitative business model that itself wasn't clearly, for that sector specifically, wasn't clearly profitable in the long run. That this is, largely subsidized by venture capital, and it's just not clear that this is going to be successful. I mean, we've seen them try and create all kinds of different gimmicks to extract. Either to extract more labor value or to extract advertising money from third parties, to, all kinds of different ways to make themselves not even more profitable, but profitable at all. And I don't doubt that will continue. Certainly, they're very creative capitalists. And so I wouldn't go so far as to say that they will never be profitable. But I think based on the basic model, the basic ride-hail model, the profitability is still in question. My conjecture is that they're going to find tiny bits of profit in all of these other ways, like they're, even these gimmicks where all of a sudden they charge you $3 extra per ride, and they say it's like in California, they say it's for the Prop 22 benefits. It's not clear that it's for the Prop 22 benefits. So that's my answer. I think that his work is really, really important. And I think especially in places like Massachusetts, Illinois, Connecticut, where we're seeing in New York, of course, this robust debates again about the rise of the third category of worker, about these sort of what I think of as a company union, getting the names and dues from workers who you don't have the right to actually fully represent under the panoply of established employment and labor rights. I think that all of those sorts of debates must be informed by the fact that we are working with a model that is by itself not only exploitative, but, as you have so correctly stated, extremely unprofitable.
Elizabeth Gaffney had a question. Elizabeth, would you like to unmute yourself?
Yes, hello, hi. I'll turn my camera on. Hello. So I just wanted clarification on one thing. I didn't catch what the term you used for like the things that don't count as upfront pricing. What was that term that you used? You said they were something products.
I've called them wage products.
Okay.
So, there's all of these like gimmicks that they essentially provide, like a quest. If you hit, and we don't know why you get a different quest as well, and I get a different quest or whatever, but you hit 100 rides and you get an extra $50 or maybe an extra $100, or whatever, all of these different offers. They call them offers, and you can in the app you can click on them. Maybe you're familiar with this, and sort of do an offer. And I'm calling them wage products because they are essentially products that their product team created to incentivize worker behavior that is intended to supplement this very low algorithmically determined base fare, which we don't know how they've come up with this upfront pricing. Drivers in California, where it's just gone into effect in the last few weeks, have called it necessarily a pay cut. Like, they don't know where this number is coming from, but they're definitely making less than they were making before. And then so they have to grab all of these different wage products that are offered to them to build upon that base fare.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah. I did notice that that Yassine Aslam is here, and Yassine is one of the workers that has been involved in the ADCU, which I mentioned. Oh, and there he has a question. Yes, Yassine, this is exactly what I have been talking about today, about how they use. So Yassine says, how do we deal with the working time? They claim they can't pay this as workers can work elsewhere. For example, an Uber driver, when not on the job, can be a delivery food for another platform. And I would love to hear your thoughts on this, Yassine. And I want to say for everyone in the audience that Yassine is probably one of the most amazing, principled, ethical advocates on behalf of Uber workers all over the world. He has taken his case all the way up to the UK High Court and received a definitive finding that he is in fact deserving of worker rights and protections, and that he is not a self-employed individual. And although the company continues to refuse to pay him for the non-engaged time that I referenced, the decision says otherwise. So I'm honored, Yassine, that you've come here. So one of the things that I like to say when I talk to policymakers or company representatives to say, oh, if you can sit at home and watch TV and wait for the next fare, which is of course not true, as you know, or you can work on what they call multi-homing, work on like several different apps. So like how do we deal with that? And I always say no one wants two bosses. Right? Like the fact that people work on 2 or 3 different apps at any given time is because they are not paid for working time. So this is actually a question that in search of the problem. The problem is that workers are not paid for all the time that they labor. And of course, in the US, minimum wage laws wouldn't actually fix this problem entirely for reasons that I could get into, but it is certainly a problem. And I think Yassine is going to say something.
Yeah, hi there. Thank you, Veena. Nice to meet you today.
Yes.
Don't want to take up too much time. So I just want to say, thank you for the introduction. So I'm from London, App Drivers and Couriers Union. So it's 10 o'clock here at night. I just saw the link, so I'll listen to Veena. So I'm a great fan of Veena. And I just want to say, even though we get the credit, we have a lot of people in the background like Veena that played a key role in terms of educating. Even like when you look at the legal case here in the UK, Alan Bogg played a big role in terms of that. So we do need, allies, supporters in terms of this fight, and Veena is one of them. So, so just want to say thank you to all the support you're giving to the workers and being a voice for us as well. But I think at the same time, we are fighting. It's not just here in the UK. We see workers around the world. One of the biggest problems that we're seeing now is more and more yellow unions and these backroom deals.
Yep.
And it's unfortunate, when I look at myself or my father, who was a factory worker, he wasn't really articulated in terms of understand the laws, but they had better rights. So my father now retired, he got a nice pension, and trade union fought this for them. They empowered these workers, and these workers never had to go into court or through the legal system to fight. Where in our case, we went through the whole legal system, we won at the Supreme Court. And again, the question I asked about the working time, that got clarified in our Supreme Court ruling. But guess what? Unions are now here in the UK going back in there and trying to negotiate with Uber. And that's, it's a big, massive sellout. And I think we have to call it out. It's like an act of solidarity. So if we're seeing it undermines all the work and the sacrifice we do. So, but I just want to highlight the fact that, look, we're seeing more and more of this. And the reason why we're seeing that is Uber knows they are losing. They know the workers are, at one stage, they used to say that it's just impossible to organize these workers. and we're winning. But I just wanted to pass that message on. And just wanted to say, mainly the main purpose was to say thank you to Veena. You're doing a great work. And it's tough out there, especially when you're trying to speak up for the workers that come from a deprived community. But end of the day, someone has to do it, and it's great to have someone like you representing and being a voice for us guys. But thank you. That's all I wanted to say. Cheers.
Thank you so much, Yassine. That was really very generous and kind. And I think that actually those few moments were better than the rest of my entire talk. So I thank you so much for speaking up. I actually wonder, since you're here and you're the expert, whether I could ask you the question that Gerald posed. So I should say at the outset that before you came, I did spend a lot of time talking about how that waiting time ends up being a control lever for the companies, and how that is key to determining how workers make variable pay and how problematic that is. That was sort of the crux of the talk. But Gerald, who organized the talk, had asked, like, how do workers organize? And I said, well, in the US with Rideshare Drivers United and the New York Taxi Workers Alliance, both of which I am close to, that they use the airport holding lot to reach out to people. And in the case of RDU, they also do one-on-one conversations, which they sort of they use an app to coordinate these one-on-one conversations. And so with ADCU, what did it look like to bring this like massive group of workers who you represent together?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, we have been organizing since 2014. So I was actually enrolled in organizing drivers back many years, and at that time, it wasn't about the worker status. It's more about the dignity and respect. So we're getting drivers getting assaulted. And to be honest, I was a bit fed up when people would contact me saying they just been assaulted by a passenger. And when you report it to Uber failed to, if anything, your job was at risk, they just kick you off the job. So it's like in the early days when I started working for Uber, I was earning about £50 an hour, which is very good money. And don't forget, I actually started this job back in 2006. So I was like a taxi or a minicab driver. So when Uber come into the market, it wasn't like something changed for me. It's just moving from one employer to another employer. So it was a job for me. But at that time, like I said, we were earning good money. But anyway, we just started organizing through a WhatsApp group. So it's quite important to be active in these groups. So we had a community of, like a relationship with, fellow workers. And before you know it, we then started, meeting at, parking lots. We formed up different structures. We then joined a big union, GMB union, back in 2015. But before we even joined them, we were actually looking at that legal case against Uber. But the problem we had with the GMB was there's a big, massive clash. They represented the taxis and we represented the minicab or Uber drivers or private hire drivers, they call it in the UK. Now, when you look at New York, it's completely different. When you look at a yellow cab, it is diverse, it is BME community. And when we say BME, what that means is Black, Asian, minority communities, where here in London, it's completely the exact opposite. So when you look at the black taxi, they call them, they are all, majority, 96% of them are white British, where on the other side, we had 100,000 drivers in London who are BME from Black, Asian, minority community. Now, people say it's a low-skilled job. I actually come from an IT background, so yes, maybe I'm not like, I don't talk a lot, whatever, but I come from a different kind of background. But I did have an IT job, and I was made redundant, but I liked driving it, the temporary thing, and I've just been stuck into it since 2006. So like the key thing to us organizing was we were consistent. So since 2015, even as of today, we have a meeting in one community center, and we still have that every month without fail. And it just really comes down to the fact that when you're consistent and you don't give up, and it's like, what was it? What do we want to sell for? We want to sell for, like, our demands are clear. Like, we wanted the workers right. We want to make sure there's protection. And even the drivers at the time were against us, thinking we're trying to shut down Uber. And we got a lot of attacks, a lot of trolls. But guess what? Since we won, every single driver was paid holiday pay. every single driver were owed minimum wage. And these were the wage drivers saying it's not entitled. But going back to the organizing thing, yes, it's difficult because the drivers don't have a fixed place of work. So it's not just easy to go, even if you turn around and have access to the Uber hubs or Uber base, you cannot recruit there. That's not possible. So you got to look at ways of how you do it. So when we were having our meeting, we used to, a majority of the drivers here are Muslim. So we used to have iftars event. We embrace with the community. So let's say one of the drivers, if they had like a function or something, we'll all communicate. But I think the main thing for us was just being consistent and having that meeting every month. And you get 10 guys come one time, maybe they won't come next time, but then you get another batch. But you just got to be there and you just got to do it. But I mean, the odds are stacked against you. It's never going to be easy, but you just need to be leaders. And I think from my side, I come to the end of the stage, and one of my job is to make sure we have more leaders come forward and step up. We are established not just in London. We have branches across the UK. We network with drivers internationally. But yeah, I mean, really it comes down to, just being consistent, not being scared. The odds are stacked against you. And I think you feel isolated as well at times, but I think we broke those barriers. There is no isolation. So drivers are no longer isolated. You could talk to the New York taxi workers line. You could talk to the drivers in California. So that was the purpose. The purpose behind the platform was to rely on these BME workers, because Uber never imagined that these guys going to resist. They just don't understand. They just want to earn money and go back. But we're able to break all that. And now, going forward, since we won, is we get about 20, 30 people join up every day, and we don't go out recruiting no more. We get 20, 30 drivers join our union. And that's because they're no longer scared. They realize, look, the law is on our side. These guys are fighting for us. And Uber has got deals with other unions, but they're not growing. They're just sitting there, and people see who's working for them, who's helping for them, and they're there. So, we come from 2014, we're a very powerful union. We have thousands of members across the UK. We've got money in our bank account. We're taking on legal action, one after another. So it's not just about legal action, even though people talk about this. So if you look at the Uber case that we won, it wasn't just us filing the case. We did so many protests, we did strikes, we lobbied politicians, we reached out to academics, we worked with, so there is a bit of everything. It wasn't just, the side. And like I said, again, we had a great, brilliant legal team that came forward and they supported us on a pro bono basis. Yeah, but it's just like the position we are self-sustained, and that's the goal. That should be the goal, to be able to build a movement. So you're not reliant on any funding and like external sources. So we were always looking for funding, which we never got.
Right.
But eventually it cracked through that, look, we can't be reliant on anyone. We have to do it. It's our movement, it's our fight, and we've got to fight. But anyway, I think I'm taking up your time.
This is the best part of, I think everyone here can agree that this is much better than my talk. And I just wanted to say a couple of things, Yassine. I mean, first, that I deeply, deeply admire and honor all that you have done. I'm tremendously moved by the way in which you not just organized your coworkers, but also consistently stood up against attempts at yellow dog unionization, which is becoming more and more of a problem. And as I heard you speaking, I was just struck. I've read a lot of labor history books, as many people here might have, and the story is always the same in terms of successful organizing. It is building loving, caring community through things like iftar dinners in religious or community halls. It is always this in-person interaction. You never hear a successful story or read a successful labor win where it was actually the union bosses and the firm bosses coming together and making a backroom deal that ultimately sells out the workers, which is essentially, I think, what happened in Washington State, which almost happened in California. And what I'm really worried is increasingly happening. We saw, for example, the UFCW, which represents not a single Uber driver in Canada, made a special backroom deal with Uber. We have no idea what the terms of that contract are. You have workers in New York who are members of the IDG, which is a segment of the machinists union who is completely funded by Uber and Lyft. You have, or mostly funded by Uber and Lyft. We have, more recently the ITF coming up with a quote unquote historic agreement. These are all these people, all of these labor representatives who haven't done the work that you and your comrades have done of really forming these one-on-one relationships, building meaningful community and building real power, in large part, I think, because they think it's not worth it. And there's something deeply troubling about that, given that the workers in these sectors are primarily, as you said, BM. In the US, there are 70% racial, nationally 70% racial minority and immigrants. In the Bay Area, there are 80% racial minority and immigrants. And so when you have union leaders sort of giving up rights on behalf of workforces that they haven't attempted to organize meaningfully, that they don't actually represent, whose consent they don't have, there's an element of colonialism actually reflected in the power dynamics. And I wanted to emphasize that what you said about the odds already being really stacked against us, to emphasize that this third route, this shaking hands with Uber behind people's backs and calling this a historic agreement. This is happening right now in Massachusetts, in Illinois, in New York. This is an ever-present threat, and instead of in every legislative cycle, it's like playing whack-a-mole. Like we have to convince labor leaders that this is not the route to go, as opposed to going into the streets and into the communities and building worker power and standing together and fighting for basic rights and growing those basic rights, which has been particularly troubling. And my hope is that this particular paper that I'm working on will underscore the difficulties, the extraordinary, cruel, and exploitative difficulties of even calculating pay for workers in a place like California, where algorithmic wage discrimination, this practice of paying workers different amounts for different over time, where this is legalized, how cruel it is, how difficult it makes it to survive, and how it disconnects work from survival. So like you said, your dad worked as a factory, a working class factory worker. He was able to retire with a pension, and he had a trade union that represented him, and probably over time his wages at least provided a way to provide for his family. Yeah. And as you know, there are many Uber drivers in California that I know who live in tents, in unhoused in unhoused communities in San Francisco and Sacramento. It should not be that one works 60 hours a week for a large, well-financed firm, and as a result, still cannot afford housing, cannot afford food, cannot afford the basics. And so that's the purpose of this paper, and this conversation has really been that disconnect is extraordinarily immoral, unfair, and cruel.
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, just going back to your point. So it's just like, it's not that the workers don't have resources. And I'm not here to knock the big trade union, whether it's SEIU or Teamsters. These unions, they've done a great job back in the day. But something happens. So if you look at ITF, they have millions, and I'm talking like millions, not like 100 million. Like they got money sitting in their bank account. They could afford to pay for these legal action to help. And it's like in our case, we were relying on solicitors, lawyers that done it completely free for us because they believe in the cause and they wanted to help us, but they never come forward. But since the deal is done, they now want to go on the table and negotiate. And it just brings me back. I was in Cape Town last month, and I don't like reading, but I was made to read this article, the master's house would never dismantle the master's tooth. And what we find, and when you really look at it, I read it once and I thought, wow, this is something different by Audre Lorde. Then I read it again. Then I looked at it again from my side, like from the Uber side. And what's happening is, and the reality is, the trade unions or the people around us are comfortable in the master's house right now. And that's what's the main issue. The minute they step out, and when we're trying to negotiate something, and I'm not against collective bargaining, we should be on the table. We shouldn't. It's like 6 years ago, maybe if we had some kind of agreement, but we shouldn't be negotiating something that we want. We shouldn't be going backward. We should be starting. That should be our starting point. So what we won was the basic right, and Uber did everything to fight it. So if you look at the New Zealand case, again, it's a brilliant case where drivers won the employee status. Now, if that union is going to go in and negotiate whether they should be employees or not, that can't be right. And that's where we need to be firm. Like, you know, you got to be working. And it's like us guys, we didn't know whether we're going to win or lose, but the point was we're going to keep going. We're going to keep fighting for our rights. We're not going to give up. We'll go away the minute Uber, you know, complies with the law. There's no need for us, you know, and that's where the end game is. And many people try to, you know, get rid of us. But it's just like we're doing the right thing, which is why we keep, you know, succeeding in what we're doing. And that's fighting for the right cause, being on the right side of the history.
You have all of my solidarity. And I'm going to be using this quote over and over again, that the trade unions who are negotiating with Uber to give away basic rights are too comfortable in the master's house.
You know, you remind me of, well, both of you have reminded me of a tweet that Uber CEO Dara Khosrowshahi posted, I think, sometime last year, where he apparently drove a road for Uber Eats for one dinner hour, so pathetic. And posted, you know, how much he made, and we are to assume, right, that his jobs weren't specially curated for him.
Yes, exactly.
But Ben Gross, who had a question about transparency, right? I mean, he asked, like, what would making algorithms public, like, how would that be a solution? Like, what would opening the black box, right, do for someone like Yassine, for example?
Right. So part of what I was trying to say there at the end, and Yassine can probably say more because it's his comrade James Farrar that runs the Worker Info Exchange that is trying to use GDPR to get some of this information. I think the idea is that, and this has been true across the digital economy. So the YouTubers Union in Germany, for example, for a long time, they're not a proper union because creators aren't included under, or not yet included under the collective bargaining laws. But the IG Metall, which is the largest German union, had sort of taken on the YouTubers Union as a project. And one of the things that they really just wanted was they wanted to know why it was that some of their posts on YouTube would get a ton of attention and some of their posts wouldn't get any attention. So the basic rules of the game, so that they could negotiate with the rules and earn accordingly. So they would find themselves in situations where, you know, a very popular YouTuber would all of a sudden, who was earning, you know, who's basing his entire earnings on his YouTube channel, would all of a sudden stop getting views. And so why was he stopped getting views? He wanted to know. So the idea behind transparency, I think, is that knowledge of the system will somehow make it so that the system can be more fair. But I will say, you know, as a law professor, that just because we know the rules doesn't mean that the application of the rules are in any way fair. That there is often a huge disconnect between transparency and output or effect. And so part of what I really want to emphasize in this particular paper is that while transparency is really important as a form of resistance, as a form of drawing attention to how opaque these systems are, as a way of drawing attention to how fundamentally unfair the information asymmetry is. We have very few rights in the workplace and beyond, and being able to use GDPR, the California Privacy Protection Act, to gain knowledge, or at least even to garner attention as a strategy to these practices. That this is very, very important. On another level, we know that the harms here will not be solved by transparency. The harms, the gamification, the low wages, these are harms that can be fundamentally solved by, as I say in this particular paper, sort of cultivating an abolitionist ethic in this context. This is not how we want work. It's not even radical. I find myself, I'm writing this paper and I'm like, oh my God, I can't believe I'm arguing for the minimum wage. This is not a radical position that work should be predictable, not variable, at some basic levels that people can live. These are not radical ideas. And so the fact that where we are in this fight is transparency is particularly kind of troubling. And so I'm trying to push us towards actually addressing the harm directly as we continue through these other resistance tactics like the data cooperatives or like the fight for understandability or legibility under GDPR.
Thank you, Veena. Well, we are at the end of our time slot. So would you kind of take us out by telling us a little bit about what's in the works for you? What are you working on? What are you reading? And how we can find you online?
Yeah, so you can find me online in my no, Yassine, do not apologize. This was like, everyone is so excited. I'm so excited. That was the best part of any talk I've ever given. In fact, I would ask that maybe you come to every talk and just just speak. That would be amazing. Thank you for sharing all of your knowledge. So I am, as Gerald said, I'm at CASPAS, the Center for Advanced Study of the Behavioral Sciences here at Stanford for a year. I had to sort of sell my soul to take a sabbatical. I am, meaning I have to teach contracts when I go back, which I do not want to do. But I am writing a book called Machineries of Dispossession about the rise of the on-demand economy and the convergence of neoliberal governance and venture capital to sort of form the cruel outcomes that we've talked about today. And so you can look for that in the coming year and a half or so. I'll let you guys know. You can find me online at Veena Dubal. At Twitter, again, a lot of oversharing about my children, but a lot of it is Uber related if that's what's interesting to you. And in terms of what I'm reading right now, I always have I'm always reading lots of different things. So in my commute, I'm reading The Dawn of Everything by David Graeber and David Winslow, I believe, the late David Graeber, which is really about reconceiving of how we understand the origins of humans and humankind and human nature, pushing back both against the Hobbesian sort of idea that if we didn't have law and structure, we would all be at war with each other, but also pushing back against the Rousseauian ideals that emerged during the Enlightenment period. Which is really good. And then I'm reading Joan Didion at home. I'm reading Joan Didion's The Year of Magical Thinking, which is a profound story about grief. Anyone who is bereaved, after you feel ready, I would recommend reading it. And then at work, I'm reading a lot of Poulantis. Is that how you pronounce his name? The political theorist who writes a lot about law and Marxism.
Oh, cool.
So,
cool.
I'm a very not exciting person.
No, it's the secret of academics. Anyway, I want to avoid the situation where everybody just disappears all of a sudden. So if those of you who are still around, if you want to unmute yourself in about 2 seconds and give Veena Dubal a round of applause, that'd be great. All right.
Thanks so much, guys.
Thanks everybody for coming.
Bye.